And then I will good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our participants across the world. My name is Vijay Ratnam Raman, and I am the Access to Justice Global Focal Point at UNICEF HQ. Welcome to this fourth and final webinar in our global series on access to justice for children in the era of COVID. Today's webinar is unique. Unique because it involves the launching of UNICEF's study, Achieving Justice for Children, a review of innovative data initiatives around the world, and assessing administrative data systems on justice for children, a tool for country self-evaluation. The study actually predates the COVID-19 pandemic. However, COVID has shone a sharp spotlight on the issue of administrative data on justice for children. Our lessons from the field document found that the lack of data in many countries was obstructing progress on child justice. And during the pandemic, few countries could provide disaggregated data, including on child victims and witnesses, alleged offenders, disaggregated by sex, ethnicity, age, disability. These issues on child justice data are not new. In fact, the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Their Liberty detailed these challenges that we have known for many years and made a recommendation for countries to establish appropriate systems of data collection on child justice, especially children deprived of their liberty. So today's launch and webinar are very timely. I am pleased to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. Claudia Kappa, UNICEF Senior Advisor, Data and Analytics. Rena Ramke, an independent consultant. Nada Martinovic from UNICEF Montenegro Child Protection Officer. Dario Fuletti, UNICEF Uruguay Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist, and Joseph Matwimbi from UNICEF Tanzania Child Protection Specialist. Today's webinar will be in two parts. The first will focus on the study and will also include perspectives from our country offices. And the second section will focus on the self-evaluation tool. After each section, there will be a dedicated Q&A session. So I encourage all of you to post your questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And with that, let's get underway. I'm pleased to hand over to my colleague, Claudia Kappa.
Thank you so much, Vijay, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce the first of the two studies that we're presenting today. The first study is titled Achieving Justice for Children, a review of innovative data initiatives around the world. This study has been undertaken over the last couple of years with the purpose of supporting the strengthening and improvement of administrative data through the provision of analysis on a number of different variables that are relevant when thinking about administrative data on justice for children. Of course, the aim of the study was to document challenges that countries encounter in strengthening their administrative data system on justice for children, but also document promising initiatives and reflect on lessons learned. And you see here the cover of the publication that will be made available to all the participants to this webinar and will also be posted on UNICEF website on our dedicated page on data on Friday. So let's look at the component of the study in the next slide. So we first undertook a desk review of different, for instance, indicators that exist in the area of justice for children, but also a desk review of different initiatives that have been introduced at the international or national level with the aim of strengthening administrative data on justice for children. We also hosted consultation with key stakeholders from other UN agencies, but also child justice organizations. And to gain a better understanding of a set of country experiences, we had country visits and country workshops that took place in Canada, Jordan, Montenegro, Uruguay, and the United Republic of Tanzania. We chose these countries because we wanted to have an opportunity to understand the functioning of administrative data system on justice for children across a subset of countries that have different, of course, structures. They are from different regions. They have different levels of maturity when it comes to their administrative data system. So we wanted to gain a learning from a diversified group of countries. And we are very grateful to all the partners that join us in this process of understanding strength and limitation of administrative data system. For each one of these countries, there were country teams, and we are extremely grateful to the different stakeholders that joined the conversation and the workshop and allowed us to develop this deeper understanding of the challenges, but also of the important initiatives that have been undertaken by this country to strengthen the availability and quality of this data. And I'm going to now give the floor to Rena, who has been supporting UNICEF in this important project, so that she can guide us through the actual criteria and variables that we look at in the process of building the study. Rena, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia and Vijaya. My good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you joining us as well. I'm just going to take a very brief look at what kinds of components we considered for assessment when we looked at when we were doing the country studies. And I'll just give you a little bit of detail about those findings, because we also have here 3 of the countries we visited, or representatives from 3 of the countries we visited in Uruguay, Tanzania, and Montenegro. And so I think they'll give you a little bit more information about that. I'm going to begin by telling you what kinds of things we looked at. And clearly we wanted to know who collects data on justice for children. So who holds the records and collects the information on justice for children in a country? What guidance do countries have for collecting data and statistics on justice for children? What is the data infrastructure? Is it, do they have a strong ICT system, or are they still using papers and pens? What kind of resources do they have in terms of staffing and ICT expertise? How functional and effective are the database systems that they currently have? And the completeness of data on justice for children is really looking at how, what kinds of consistency there is in data collection, as well as the completeness of indicators, disaggregation categories, coding, definitions, and the like. And then finally, not unimportantly, we look at things like data use. So how is the data that's collected on justice for children currently being employed? What is the demand? Is there a demand within ministries for this kind of information? Is the public asking for this information? And how is information developed from this data being disseminated? Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about each of these slides. The first one, in terms of primary sources of administrative data, these are the people that we spoke with in country. So each of the countries we visited had categories of children in conflict with the law, child victims and witnesses, and children in civil and administrative data or administrative law processes. So I think you can see that in terms of children in conflict with the law, we have the usual suspects here. These would be the people who you would fully expect are collecting data on justice for children. Police typically have one of the strongest systems because they're collecting, I think partly because of the command and control structure, but also because they're collecting a significant amount of information about crimes for statistical aggregate statistics produced at the end of the year. But these are the other sources under children in conflict with the law who are collecting information. Child victims and witnesses, information can come from all of these sectors. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about children in administrative and civil law processes. So these include civil, family, and religious courts. And in fact, in Jordan, we were able to visit with religious courts who had actually quite a significant data collection system. Not all of them do, but they did in Jordan. The ombudsperson and human rights institutions that we visited were largely visited to inquire whether or not they were receiving complaints from children or appeals from children about other legal processes or administrative processes. And in fact, we found that it was very rare for the ombudsperson or the human rights institutions to be receiving complaints. So they weren't getting many complaints and they didn't have a lot of data on that. Would you like to go to the next slide, please? Thanks. In terms of the legal and normative frameworks that we looked at, all countries we visited had ratified the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there was some guidance that came from that document in terms of collecting data on justice for children. I think all of the countries had specialized procedures for juveniles, child-friendly court procedures, and provisions to protect vulnerable and at-risk children. The provision of legal representation and aid for children in justice processes was relatively new, but we found that, that most countries had some kind of regulation or were developing regulation if they didn't already have any kind of laws in these areas. And while child participation in civil and family disputes was covered under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, some countries also had legislation, national legislation in this area. The two other areas, justice for children, national policy and action plans, was something that was a relatively new development. Most countries had had juvenile justice action plans and were in the process of completing violence against children action plans, but there weren't a lot of countries at the time who had combined the notion of child victims and children in administrative and civil processes along with children in conflict with the law. The studies were all completed in 2019. So, we're coming along a couple of years later, and it's, I understand that some of the countries have moved into justice for children plans. And then finally, the provisions for data capture and reporting are actually quite important. Sometimes these are found in a Statistics Act, where there's a statutory requirement for them to be collecting certain data on children. There are periodic reports required by different UN agencies that do require a certain amount of data capture. And some countries, I'm hoping Uruguay in particular, but Montenegro as well, will talk about the fact that they've developed data governance frameworks. And these are actually extremely valuable for ensuring people know what their responsibilities are in terms of capturing data and reporting on justice for children. Okay, the next one. data infrastructure and resources, clearly we identified that the most functional technologies for data infrastructure were electronic. It was best if they had intranet or web or cloud-based platforms so that there was a seamless connection between local offices and a central office for, for example, police posts and the national headquarters of the police where they collected and analyzed the data. And we also found that the use of business intelligence software to automatically generate graphics really helped with the creation of some demand and dissemination, and a very quick and easy way of generating data on key performance indicators in the area of justice for children. We found that staff retention was generally quite high, with the exception of the police, who have a mandatory rotation system where they're transferred after a couple of years or promoted, and so they don't necessarily stay in the same position for a great length of time. There was some need for training. And in terms of sustainability and budgeting, we really found two different models. One where there was a national institutional budget line to support the development and maintenance of administrative data systems, or there was a reliance on donors to fund ICT and administrative databases. And in the terms of the latter, it was just really important that there was a country plan for all of the administrative database systems, so that they weren't being developed in isolation without the ability to develop linkages among them. Okay, next. Yes, when we looked at the effectiveness of the database system, we were really looking at that whole notion of coordination and the ability to link or integrate data systems. And so there are some fine examples of that all over the countries that we visited. There's a Child Protection Information Management System Plus that's quite excellent. There were a lot of health database systems that were very, very good and could provide some good models for this. In the terms of just justice for children, we found that the justice sector as a whole had some, had some strengths in terms of development, for example, within the judiciary, but no development maybe in correction centers. So we found it was a little bit spotty and the coordination wasn't always there. Transmission, as I discussed earlier, may not be an issue if you have an intranet or web or cloud-based system and it's electronic. Storage is also something that is worth mentioning, because clearly if data is held in paper files, those are quite vulnerable to potential climate emergencies, or just over time they'll disintegrate or wear. And they also require an awful lot of space for storage. So clearly, if we're looking at cloud or web-based systems, you've got a much more secure and durable storage system. We go to the next slide, really around the completeness of data on justice for children. One of the things that I mentioned that was fairly critical was that there is consistency across the sectors, which include the police, the prosecution, the courts, other legal counsel, social welfare officers who are supporting children, and parole officers among them, and corrections, for example. So all of those different sectors providing services to children in contact with the law need to have some kind of consistency in terms of the definitions that they're using, the coding that they're using, the actual indicators that they're using to report on, and the same levels of disaggregation. The higher the consistency, the higher the quality and the more reliable the data. Okay, can we go to the next, please? Yeah, and finally, you know, there's virtually, there's no incentive to improve or strengthen your administrative data systems if the data isn't really being used. And so, you know, we found that this was one area that almost all of the countries could work on, trying to develop a demand for the data that's collected on justice for children that's outside of simply looking at this through the lens of public safety, which is one lens, but it's not the only lens. And so we really found that most of the countries only use data on justice for children to produce aggregate crime statistics. And you know, these indicators also feed into the SDGs. They provide data for operational planning and the allocation of resources. They're available for research. You know, they can hold government institutions to account in terms of making sure that they're achieving the progress that they're intended to achieve in justice for children. So we found that data needed to be perceived as having a strategic value. And for that, you generally needed a vision and some leadership. Okay. I think that's it for me. So I'm going to turn over to Uruguay, I think it is. Is Uruguay first up for this? Who will then, oh, Montenegro, my apologies. My apologies. I'll turn over to Montenegro to talk a little bit about their system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, for organizing this webinar. And I want to send regards to all the colleagues who are present here today. My name is Nada, and I'm, as Vijaya said, Child Protection Officer. And here on the webinar with me is my colleague Nela Krnic, who is coordinating child protection program. So basically, she can complement if I miss something. Next slide, please. Okay, as this is a global webinar, just to say a few words for those who are less familiar about Montenegro, which is an upper middle income country that is situated in southeastern Europe. And it has a coast on the Adriatic Sea. So basically, we are one of the ex-Yugoslav countries surrounded by Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, and Albania. As you can see, we are pretty small country with 620,000 inhabitants, of which 21.8% are children. So basically, since regaining independence in 2006, Montenegro has been striving to complete its transition to a well-functioning democracy country, for which the European Union integration process has played a major role in both legislation, but also is the institutional framework of the country. Next slide, please. Well, when we talk about administrative data for children, we cannot, as you know, talk separately without mentioning, I mean, overall judicial justice reform process, which basically was happening in Montenegro over the past decade. And it was mainly a result of concentrated partnership between the government of Montenegro, European Union, and UNICEF. So we developed completely new separate legislation that has been in line with international standards. We did a specialization of all justice professionals who are dealing with children in criminal legislation. And basically, as a result of this reform, there is a clear trend on decrease of juvenile delinquency in the countries and application of alternative measures, with 30% of children in conflict with law who go on diversion. And with all these efforts, we actually advocated and we developed juvenile justice indicators that were part of at that point judicial information system. Anyhow, these indicators were, we consulted Transmoni and UNODC indicators, and were related to children in conflict with the law, children victims and witnesses of crime, but the system itself, who was for the judiciary, was very anachron, and it was with no real-time data. In parallel with these reform processes, we shifted our attention not only to juvenile justice, but to broader issues surrounding child access to justice. And this basically encompasses, as you know, the rights of children in all court proceedings, so in civil, administrative, and criminal, and both as offenders, victims, and witnesses, but also parties in civil and administrative proceedings. And we did some legislation changes, but also some a lot of capacity building efforts, introduction some new institutes that support more visibility of children, particularly in family law related proceedings. And with that, we actually came to the point that we need to revise these indicators that I mentioned, that were juvenile justice indicators, but to somehow expand it to all children in court proceedings. And as you know, majority of children who appear in civil proceedings, particularly family and civil proceedings, were invisible. In 2019, with the support of Norwegian government, financial support, and with the technical support of UNDP, Ministry of Justice started the process of developing completely new information system that will include not only courts, but also that will include misdemeanor courts, administrative courts, and also execution of criminal sanctions. And here was our momentum, where we actually advocated and we actually developed indicators who were related to all children, to all children in court proceedings. And these indicators are were approved by the Judicial Council and the Ministry of Justice. At the moment, we are now, we can go on the next slide, please. We are now in the process of actually where courts this year it will be pilot phase, where we actually in few courts will these indicators, not only for children but all, will be tested and then spread to all the country. I just want to say that in parallel with this process, the reforms of other the reforms of other systems were undergoing. So we have, apart from the judicial, we have IT system in child protection, in social protection system, and we supported system to develop indicators related to violence, exploitation, and abuse. And also in police, unfortunately, the system, I mean, they don't have IT system, but they mostly do a paperwork. What is our lesson learned is basically that we gradually advocated and tried to develop IT system from juvenile justice to broader access to justice and child-friendly justice. And basically we use our comparative advantage in this area. besides that, we, as I said, we are a front runner country to the accession of the EU. So one of the, let's say, criteria is to have a proper and disaggregated data. And we also use this momentum as well in this process. Next slide, please. Up, sorry. When we talk about challenges, we still have low awareness of the main stakeholders, or in general, about the importance of disaggregated data. And also, apart from the global pandemic that slowed down a bit process, we also in December 2020 changed the government after 3 decades of the same one. So basically, so a lot of processes are on hold, and the big systematization of line ministers is ongoing. So basically, we do have a bit of stagnation in this process. Next slide, please. Okay, yes, and what is our, I mean, what is our role is to proceed with these indicators, which we really hope that we will finally have, based on which we will finally have the accurate data on number of children who are in justice system, and their role, and the legal, their role, and whether they will get a legal aid and so on. There are a number of indicators we developed and that are adopted. And this IT judicial system, as I said, will cover courts, misdemeanor courts, execution of criminal sanctions, and will be interconnected with prosecution IT system. And yeah, that would be it from my side. If my colleague Nella wants to complement with something, Nella, please feel free. Hello?
Hello?
Hi, Nella.
Hello?
Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm sorry, it was difficult to find actually option to speak. In principle, no, I think that Nada had excellent presentation, and I think that the only struggle, which is probably the major struggle for every country, is the fact that it's very difficult to come to the data about the overall number of children who are in contact with the law in one system. And that is the main challenge for us. And without this, actually, we hardly can measure progress in any of the areas. So that's like the major struggle at the moment. Out of that, I think that actually Nada very well emphasized all points. And thank you very much for considering actually our work in this area for this webinar. That would be from my side. All the best. And now I don't know how to actually mute myself. I see. Okay. So
Thank you so much, Nella. And thank you very much, Nada. So we will move on to the next presentation, which is UNICEF Tanzania. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Nada. Good afternoon from Tanzania. Yeah, this has really been a reflection for Tanzania as we went through it. So in terms of overall child justice reform, Tanzania had made quite significant progress. We have key legislation for children, including free legal assistance, and we have 236 designated juvenile courts scattered around the country, and have key statutory platforms that actually brings together all government child justice actors. So in terms of context, we had our guiding document since 2013 that actually coordinates all actors on reform, objectives, and key areas of implementation. Data coordination, however, was not very visible under this strategy. So this is why each institution collects and reports data on its own requirements. And in this, judiciary has been actually the most advanced one, because with the judicial statistical dashboard, which they actually used on a daily basis, clients can file documents online. It provides SMS alerts when the case is due, and it actually enables to track every court, magistrates, and judge what they have done on a daily basis. So it's quite effective, and they actually utilize it on a very daily basis. So this is why it's actually coming out very strongly and very much appreciated. But still, overall, data infrastructure is an issue. Justice institutions are still between paper and electronic systems, so it varies as you go down to the subnational level. So this is really a challenge. Next, please. In terms of areas for strengthening, of course, one key issue for Tanzania is lacking of a sound data governance framework on justice for children data in terms of what to collect, what and when to report. But I'll come on this one in a minute. So gaps in legislation such as the conflicting provisions how institutions other than the National Bureau of Statistics can report certain data among the legislative gaps that needs to be addressed. So not all institutions are actually mandated to report their data. So this is actually made by some of the existing legislation. So gap in legislation is part of the overall area that actually needs to be looked at. Regarding transparency, it is still to be clear on what type of data should be open available, as well as clarifying which institutions should report on which indicators. So there is no overlap. So in terms of linkage, institutions are yet also to agree what types of data from one institution needs to be accessible by another institution to address data integration. So that is an important area towards improving our systems. And lastly, data is not seen as a strategic asset. So promotion of this among decision makers, implementers, and public is still key for us here. So next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of a way forward, of course, the good news is that we have a second child justice strategy that has been launched this March. So this strategy addresses data coordination. So priority for Tanzania now is to come up with a data governance plan that will actually address overall management of available data, usability, integrity of data on justice for children. So advocacy for this to existing key national criminal justice forum is what we are looking at the moment. So we know actually what we need to start with in terms of governance plans. So there are advantages, as I mentioned, we had already the existing platform that we can already start with to utilize to agree in terms of what should go into the data governance plan. So this is a short summary for Tanzania. Thank you. So over to you, Dario. Thank
you. Thank you, Joseph. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone here. I will start with a bit of context, as Nada did. Next slide, please. Uruguay is a high-income country. Since a few years ago, it is also quite a small country with 3.5 million people. Around 300,000 of us are between 13 and 17 years old, which is what the law establishes as adolescents for these matters. Unfortunately, we have one of the rates of adolescents deprived of their liberty among the highest in our region, in Latin America. The good news is that it has been going down. In fact, the number of adolescents deprived of their liberty has fallen by half in the last 5 or 6 years. But well, this is like a bit of the context. This is really a problem for us. Next slide, please. Since 2019, Uruguay has a report that includes 34 indicators related to juvenile justice. They try to cover the whole process from adolescents being detained by the police, the proceedings initiated against them, the duration of the trial, the number of adolescents judged guilty, or the ones that are completing sentences according to that type of sentence. As Rina mentioned at the first minutes of this webinar, I'm going to talk more about the governance of the group, which is a bit particular, I think. These indicators are produced by different institutions that I listed there that we managed to get together in a group that we call Mesa de Indicadores, and that is what formed a few years ago. These institutions are the Ministry of the Interior, there's the police, the Supreme Court of Justice, of course, the National Prosecutor's Office, and also the National Institute for Adolescent Social Inclusion, which is the institution that implements the criminal sentences. And the agreement, this 34 indicator was made within this group, and that agreement has been signed by the authorities and is a formal document that states the role that each institution has, and it also lists the indicators that each institution is going to provide each year. The agreement also says that UNICEF will act as the facilitator in the group. That is, UNICEF is the one that calls for the meeting, that receives the data, that compiles information, and the one that publishes it also. And this agreement also states when the information has to be delivered. It says that the institution must produce the information within 4 months each year, within the first 4 months of each year. And we already have the data for 2020, although it's not published yet. And this is quite an important part, having this kind of agreement, because we managed to keep producing the indicators even after a change in government. We had a party in government that had been for 15 years until last year, and now the process continues without problems in the new government. And next slide, please. As I tell you the process, it seems quite straightforward to get together institutions and each one playing its part, but really, in terms of lessons learned, at first, it must say that it takes a long time to come to this conclusion. We needed to do, of course, a lot of advocacy. We started our first efforts in the beginning of the last decade, because there was adolescents started being blamed for a rising crime, and there were discussions about lowering the age that to be tried as an adult. This unfortunately failed, but what really was shown that the people talked about these matters without having clear data, and each institution had different numbers. So when the UNICEF started to form this group with all the institutions, there was, after they agreed to participate, there was also a long process of sharing data and understanding, each institution understanding what the other one was reporting, because in some cases, the numbers were completely different. And what happened was that some institutions were counting really adolescents, but other institutions were counting judicial files, and you can have more than one for each person. And well, that kind of problems had to be solved before getting to the agreement. So in addition to the formal agreement, which is signed by the authorities of each institutions, and this was signed in 2018, and there is also a manual that you can see some screenshots in the right side of the screen that say clearly, describe the indicators, which institution is responsible for producing it, also which disaggregation, and the data categories of each one. So the takeaways of the process is that first, it needs a lot of advocacy, of course, to come together. That it is very useful to have a formal agreement that allows this process to continue even after changes in government or changes in policies within this institution. It is the previous process, although it's long and painstaking, it's really important to have it done, because then the institutions trust in each other's data. We don't have an IT system that it centralizes all the data. Only the police and the judiciary share some part of the system. It's really shared within the group. And the other lesson is that really UNICEF is the one that needs to take the lead in this kind of efforts, because at least in Uruguay, it's difficult to get these kind of institutions to work together and collaborate, because there is no clear leader in a hierarchical sense. So really UNICEF was the one that pushed for this to be completed. And that will be it for me. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Dario, and Joseph and Nada as well. Mine was the last slide that was just up, and these general lessons, I think, have really been covered by the representatives of the various countries, but I do want to highlight two of them that we really learned when we were studying the countries. The first one is that you can't actually strengthen an administrative database system only on children in the justice system. It needs to be done within the justice sector's database system itself. So I think that's fairly obvious, but I think, you know, some people have spoken about trying to develop a database just for children. And we found that, at least in the countries that we've visited, the justice sector's administrative data system tends to be the best one to work within. And I guess the second thing is thinking about what kind of capabilities you want when you link databases. Future research people might be interested in conducting future research, for example, to see if children who come in contact with the law continue to suffer from poverty or other kinds of issues through the rest of their lives. And so if you're able to link some of your Justice for Children databases, you know, you might link a corrections base or have access at some time in the future to follow that particular child and find out if he or she ended up, you know, having filing taxes or not filing taxes, or being on social insurance rolls or something. Then you actually need to have some kind of unique identifier. And that's a big challenge in places where birth registration is low. And, you know, some places have social insurance numbers, but those may not kick in until a child is of working age, legal working age. Some people have nationality numbers, you know, birth certificates, but you know, it's something that is inconsistent. So it's something that will need to be worked on to develop the capability to follow a child across different sectors and databases. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rena. Colleagues, we have 2 questions that we've received. I'm conscious of time. The first question comes from Canada. What is the framework or system for internationally comparable juvenile justice indicators? Perhaps, Claudia, you could take that question. And then the second question that we have is from the Gambia, where they face similar challenges as the countries who have been presenting, where they receive data from all of the key partners, but when it is collated, the numbers don't add up or tell a story. And interest in whether there are good practices or examples on how to harmonize data for justice, child justice. Ren, I think part of what you were talking about before, just now, goes to that question. But perhaps, Claudia, do you want to start with that question, and then we will hand over to maybe to Rena, and let me see if any of the country officers would like to speak from the panel. Thanks, Claudia.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the question. In the process of preparing for these country studies, Rena looked at different indicators that exist and indicator frameworks that exist on justice for children from a number of different initiatives. And the report actually contains a minimum set of 18 indicators that have been identified through looking at the different framework that exist. Of course, these indicators, we selected them for the purpose of running the country study and using these indicators as a way of checking the ability of the country to report on what we consider to be a core set of measures. Now, as a next step to this work, of course, I think there is very much this need of having a core set of indicators supported by clear metadata that can be used by country as the basics upon which they need to build their data system. But we are not at that stage yet in terms of having this core set of international agreed indicators. So this is one of the takeaway from the work is this need of having a core set of indicators, run them by country to check really their feasibility, refine them further, and then develop metadata documentation to support. But I want to give also Rena the opportunity to comment on this because she has been really instrumental in promoting this identification of these indicators. So I would like her to weigh in as well on this point. Over to you, Rena.
Thanks, Claudia. And thanks, Lisa, for that question. I guess everything that Claudia said is very true. To give you an idea of the kinds of things we looked at or the existing indicator lists we looked at, we of course started from the 2006 UNICEF UNODC juvenile justice indicators, and of course found that what was missing from that were indicators on child victims and witnesses and indicators on children involved in administrative and civil procedures. So we looked at a few others. Montenegro had a source from 2013 when they developed indicators. I know that's all been updated now, but we used some of the indicators that were within countries to build something that we used across the countries. Uruguay also, through its governance framework, data governance framework, has some juvenile justice indicators. Transmoni, as Nada mentioned, had a series of very good indicators on victims and parties to disputes. The EU also, because of the accession of Montenegro into the EU, we took a look at their civil and administrative law data indicators, and Latin America and the Caribbean Regional Office of UNICEF also has a set of indicators that we reviewed. In terms of the question, which is a really good one, about how you begin to harmonize, I think in some ways you share an experience with Tanzania. And so, I find it interesting that Joseph has discussed the need to establish a data framework. And I guess I would say it's hard to know when there's no harmonization. It's really hard to know where some of the bottlenecks are in being able to develop that. So, maybe the first thing to do is to take a look at some of the gaps and some of the strengths in the system. But I would open that up in some ways to Joseph. I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you have some ideas about how someone might get started with this in terms of that Gambia question.
Thank you, Rena. Maybe just to add, as you have just said, yes, in terms of harmonization, the challenge is that, the different institutions within the justice are maybe at different stages. So one may be advanced and one may not be so advanced. So it cannot work very straightforward. So what we, as I said in my presentation, what we thought would be was like to take stock in terms of what is existing and what could be the entry points in terms of what actually the institutions would like to have as accessibility to another institution. So that those will be the entry points that could be captured and agreed upon as a starting point. As you have said, it cannot, I think also in the report, it's indicated that it's not an easy thing to just integrate because of the different stages, but I think you can identify the entry points depending on the different levels that each institutions are at. So just wanted to add on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Nada, did you want to go ahead and just provide a comment quickly? I'm just conscious of the time.
Yeah, just to say that I think that it's so important once that we engage in development of indicators to engage with the National Statistical Office, Monstat or so ever. So basically to harmonize these indicators in, for example, judicial information system with Monstat indicators. And I think it's so important. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Nada. Colleagues, we have some good questions coming in. I'm just conscious of time and we are going to as well perhaps move on to the next section and circle back to a couple of these questions that have been posed as well. So please know that your questions have been noted. I'm going to hand over to Claudia and Rena to talk about the tool for country self-evaluation. Over to you, Claudia.
Thank you, Vijay. And I think this is a nice segue because many of the questions were about, or the points were about what can be done to help countries strengthen their administrative data system. So as a follow-up to the study, the multi-country study, we developed a tool that countries can use for self-evaluation to understand really the strengths and the limitations that exist in their ability to produce quality data on justice for children. So it's really a set of instruments that countries can use to assess the current effectiveness of their data system and identify where investments are needed to improve performance. The toolkit is built on a data maturity model. So there is a specific table in this publication that again will be sent out and will be made available online this week on data.unicef.org. There is a model that explains what are the different phases of a system that goes from a low level of maturity to a well-functioning system that is able to produce effectively good quality data on justice for children. On the basis of this model, then we develop a set of questions that the countries can go through collectively, and we are going to have more information in the presentation by Rena. What are the type of questions that countries can use to really understand where they stand? There are three components to this toolkit. There are three separate booklets. A first booklet that is very much a sort of an instruction document on how to use the toolkit, what's the intention. And then a second booklet that has a questionnaire that is meant to be used by sectors, the police, the court, etc. They go through this set of questions to see where they stand in terms of their ability to respond to these questions. And then there is a third booklet that contains a questionnaire for central reporting facility and all stakeholders. I'm going to hand it over again to Rena, who will give you an example of how this toolkit is being structured and what type of things this toolkit cover. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia. Yeah, I am conscious of time, so I just want to be fairly quick about this. I want to let you know that the questionnaire was really developed based on what we learned from the country studies about what elements of a administrative database system were most critical for producing good data on justice for children. And I want to also let you know a little bit with a little bit more clarity, and following up on Nada's comment that in fact the questionnaire that's designed for the central reporting facility would, you know, in the case of Montenegro, include Monstat, which is the National Statistics Office, because it would really be the institution that would have responsibility for collecting all of the data and producing a single report. In Uruguay, I think that central reporting facility, which is collecting all the data from the Data Governance Framework Agreement, is UNICEF, but it might be different in different countries. So just to know that they are engaged and are involved in filling out questions. So these are the elements or the components that make up the assessment. And you can see that they're very familiar. They're pretty much based on some of what we were looking for when we undertook the country studies. What I'd like to do is just give you, I'm going to pull out the question of coordination of data on justice for children and show you a little bit, or give you an overview of how we address that, both in the questionnaire and in the data maturity model. So what we have in the questionnaire is 3 questions related to the idea of coordination of data on justice for children. And those are, you know, those are here. What formal and informal collaboration exists among different government institutions and agencies responsible for justice for children? Have information and communication technology systems and related interagency departmental protocols been developed in order to facilitate data exchange flows? So, you know, for the first question, we're looking at things like data governance frameworks. And in the second question, we might be looking at more of memoranda of understanding. And then finally, are data accessible through linkages or integration of database systems? So countries are given the 3 different scenarios that they can select from, which help them to determine where they are in the development or strengthening of their administrative data system on justice for children. If we go to the next, slide, this is what the maturity model looks like for the component of coordination of data on justice for children. So you can see that the model really looks at 3 different categories, and they're ideal types. So I would suspect no country fits perfectly within each of these, but they do give you a good example of which systems require more strengthening, which systems are getting it right and moving towards a fully mature system, and which systems are already there and have a data maturity model in this area. So you can see that for coordination of data on justice for children, I have to read mine, my head's covering there. That, you know, a system is mature if it has a formal interagency committee that ensures there are protocols in place for sharing and exchanging information among stakeholder institutions. And information systems can interact, and committee members are comfortable contacting one another when they are in need of data. Information sharing protocols among involved institutions exist, and data is shared securely and electronically across these institutions. Data shared by paper tends to be less secure. And ICT systems were developed to ensure full integration of the police, prosecution, court, and social welfare database systems. That would be a very mature system. I want to note that some of the questions have come around the privacy of data and the security of information. And to note that, you know, I guess there a robust privacy law that is actually implemented is fairly important. And I know that a lot of countries are in the process of updating or developing their privacy laws to account for the proliferation of electronic data. And I guess the other thing, the other area where it's important to ensure data security and privacy is in the training of staff around confidentiality, particularly those children who are, or those staff who are interacting directly with children to record the information at the most local level. So, you know, one of the things we discovered when we asked people, and this was everywhere, we asked what happened with juvenile justice files once they reached the date at which they were to be expunged. And, you know, there was no guarantee that those files necessarily disappeared in a lot of countries. And so I think it's really important to make sure that privacy and record expungement components of the law are implemented, are effectively implemented. Okay, I think that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Rena and Claudia. Colleagues, we have time for a few more questions before we close off. One of the questions that a few people have asked is in relation to this point about tracking children across different databases. And that linkage across these different data sets. And how do you protect the child's privacy and anonymity so that it doesn't come back to haunt them, particularly children in conflict with the law? I wonder if, Claudia, you can perhaps start us off, and or Rena can answer that question. And colleagues, please share any other questions you have. Over to you, Rena.
Actually, yeah, that was the question I was very quickly trying to respond to when I just finished up that presentation with regard to expungement of juvenile records and you know, the enforcement of privacy law and very, you know, strict training and awareness around these issues. I think it's a concern for sure. And I think different countries are going to, you know, are going to have to develop different ways of addressing that. One of the things we talked about was trying to develop a, you know, some kind of a unique identifier for a child that's maybe still anonymous. I mean, there are some ways of doing this in a way that still protects a child, but I think the concern is a real one. And I don't know if colleagues from the countries have anything to add about this. You know, I can't answer that in a brief way at all. So.
No, thank you for that, Rena. I think certainly it is an issue, a critical issue, and something that will continue to be an issue as these systems become more and more sophisticated. Certainly being able to track children through the different systems is an important one for the response and tracking their well-being and developing policy and responses that can address the issues that children face, but protecting their privacy, of course, is as critical an issue. Colleagues, we don't have any other questions at the moment, but of course we happily will receive your questions and provide answers to them in the coming days. As Claudia has mentioned, the publications will be live shortly, and more information will be available through them. So with that, perhaps I can hand over to Claudia. Did you want to wrap us up and conclude today's webinar?
Yes, thank you, Vijaya. And let me conclude with, first of all, thanking the team, the presenters, for not only for the time they spent today sharing their experience and their expertise, but also for their generosity in supporting this project over the last couple of years. This has been a collective understanding, a collective result, and I really want to acknowledge the contribution of all of those who have contributed. In this spirit, we see the toolkit, for instance, as a tool and an instrument that is dedicated to countries. It's really something that we would like countries to take on. And of course, we also know that through this process of countries' engagement around the toolkit, there could be improvement. And we are very much looking forward to receiving the feedback from those who are willing to use the toolkit, to make sure that this toolkit is as useful as possible to countries using it. So if there are specific teams that would like to use the toolkit and they would like to share with us the learning from the application of the toolkit to the country system, please do not hesitate to be in touch. The toolkit comes, as Rena mentioned, with a set of questions. The set of questions allow for the self-evaluation with a scoring system that gives a value at the end and allow the country to understand at which stage in this maturity model they are. But of course, this has to come hand in hand with the recommendation of how to strengthen and what can be done really to improve the system once we come to this understanding of what the bottlenecks exist. So we very much look forward to the possibility of working with partners to improve the toolkit, but also to assist countries in moving from the toolkit into the investments and action that are necessary to improve the quality and availability of data of administrative on justice for children. So this is a first step, and we look forward to working together to improve the quality of the records and fulfill every child's rights when it comes to his or her contact with the justice system. So thank you so much to all. Thank you, Vijaya, for the wonderful moderation, and I look forward to being in contact on the next steps. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for those final words, and colleagues around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure having you join us on these series of webinars. And it's been a pleasure to have these discussions about children's access to justice in the era of COVID. With that, we wish you all a good day, a good afternoon, a good night, wherever you are. Thank you all once again. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.